This week we are taking up with Aristotle's book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Last time we had finished off dealing with the moral virtues, and St. Thomas is going into his teaching about, and Aristotle's teaching about, the intellectual virtues. According to St. Thomas, after finishing his study of the definition of moral virtue, Aristotle devotes Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics to a consideration of the definition of intellectual virtue by first noting that wherever science is at work, right reason, an intellectual virtue, is at work. Since right reason is at work in both speculative and practical science, we might expect Aristotle at this point to talk about right reason in both species of practical as well as speculative reason. Instead, at this point, he ignores speculative science, a species of right reason, and he only considers practical reason and its subdivisions, prudence and art. Before discussing these species of practical reason, St. Thomas notes how wherever it is found, right reason determines a mean between excess and defect, a state of perfection. While Aristotle and St. Thomas do not precisely say so, at this point, in speculative science, that mean would be truth, adequatio, a proportion, right, as expressed in a judgment of equality of proportion between the human intellect and what is. To explain more precisely the nature of right reason considered in general, what St. Thomas claims that all moral virtues considered thus far, and in all art, a man with right reason keeps his eye on a mark, on the object, so as not to do too much nor too little, not to achieve anything that needs to be added to or can be subtracted from, as he will say. This mark, this object, virtue's formal object, is the limit of the middle course, a mean between excess and defect, in accord with right reason. For the virtuous man, this mark is analogous to a rule for a craftsman, what is becoming, fitting, proportionate, what we must not add to or fall short of, the mean of virtue, the proportionate equal. It's analogous to relating contrary opposites within the same genus, like fitting the right size foot into an equally proportionate shoe. Because right reason is crucial to comprehend the nature of virtue in science, St. Thomas adds to Aristotle's claim that further inquiry about the nature of right reason is needed. He starts doing this by noting that right reason is something common, a universal principle, a measure used in all occupations involving practical science, and the same is true of speculative science, although he doesn't mention that. But in the practical sciences like strategy, medicine, and so on. In all these sciences, neither too much nor too little should be done or excluded. What determines measures is what holds the middle and accords with right reason. But he adds, the man who considers this common measure rule alone because of its generality, because of the many ways it can be applied, will not know how rationally to use it in the individual situation. For example, he says, from knowing that the right measure in science is right reason, if in an individual situation a person asks the physician precisely what prescription should be given to a person to restore health based upon the rule of right reason, the physician would not be able to answer. The prescription is a right plan of action, a right order of choice. And so too, as St. Thomas will tell us, is a law. St. Thomas next gives an analogy as an example. Just as the right plan of prudence, that is, the right order of choice, is the guide, the measure, the prescription in moral matters, so the right plan of art is the guide in art. Extending this analogy, he says the right plan of, we could say, the right plan of speculative science is the guide in speculative science, that is, the right order of judging. At this point, St. Thomas adds that, again, such examples taken from human habits are insufficient to know precisely how to operate in the individual situation. Put in contemporary military terms, while they give the right strategy, such examples do not give the right tactics. They are too general. To start to make up for these deficiencies, we need a precise definition of the limits of right reason, a precise determination of right reason. That is, we have to understand its specific difference. To start to give such a specific difference and precise definition, determination, St. Thomas says that Aristotle starts a study of the intellectual virtues that regulate, order human reason. And he prefaces this study with a discussion of the soul's nature, because we can only know what the virtues are by knowing what is the soul. Aristotle resumes the study of the human soul, as you might recall, he's already gone over this, by recalling its division into the rational absolutely, whose formal objects are necessary beings, or whose formal object is necessary beings, whose principles are unchangeable and unvariable, that exist, act in one fixed way. And then the division of the soul, which is rational secundum quid, which participates in reason, and is perfected by moral virtues. He's thinking about the estimative sense, for example, and the sense appetites, whose formal objects are contingent beings, whose principles are somewhat contingent, somewhat variable. He justifies this division by saying different parts, faculties of the soul, should correspond, be proportionate to different formal objects, have a proportionality of intensive quantities to each other, as I would put it. The qualitative intensive quantity or quantum receptivity and capacity of the faculty must be proportionate to the intensive quantum activity of the agent. Knowledge exists in parts of the soul according as they have a greatness of likeness, a proportion of likeness to the things known, that is, in their power. According to its peculiar nature, each faculty of the soul is qualitatively proportioned as a faculty to no formal objects that stimulate it to act. Aristotle calls scientific that part of the soul whose formal object its external stimulus is necessary beings. He calls estimative that part of the rational soul whose formal object is contingent beings. He says, estimating and deliberating refer to the same formal object, what is changeable, what is contingent. Deliberation is an inquiry not yet concluded, like argumentation, because no one deliberates about what acts exists in only one way. St. Thomas doubts this division that Aristotle makes, saying Aristotle divides the intellect into the acting part, the acting power, the power of operating on all things, and the potential, the power of becoming all things. So by their very nature, they have the same formal object, the true. The true about necessary matters and contingent matters belong to the same genus, like the perfect and the imperfect. By the same power, we apprehend the extremes of the same genus. If the faculty of sight, which is less noble in power than the intellectual power, can see incorruptible beings, like we see around us on the earth in the universe of St. Thomas and Aristotle, so can the intellectual power know necessary and contingent truths. St. Thomas solves this apparent contradiction by saying that we can understand contingent beings in two ways, abstractly and concretely. Abstractly considered, we understand contingent natures according to fixed part-whole relations in terms of their organizational parts capable of specifically generating their generic acts, which are manifest in the species, more or less perfectly. Concretely considered, we understand contingent natures according to the way they are operating, existing in the contingent situation. Abstractly considered is the way speculative sciences like physics study necessary and contingent beings as abstractly considered movers and agents. So they study action, but they study it in an abstractly considered way. Concretely considered is the way practical sciences like prudence and art proceed. Prudence and art considers things as they concretely exist, composite wholes as generating specific acts in the individual circumstances, causing them. They do this through use of particular reason, the estimative sense, which collates, specifies particular impressions into an experiential universal. Thus understood, contingent beings and operational universals are formal objects of particular reason, and necessary beings and speculative universals are formal objects of the speculative sense, of the speculative intellect, I should say. So we need the estimative sense in relationship to practical action and prudence in order to come up with a specific difference by means of which to come up with a proper definition of its formal object, the formal object of prudence. After dividing the parts of the soul, Aristotle examines the functions proper to each part of the soul by considering the intellectual virtues by which each part is perfected. He proposes a common definition of virtue as what renders good a thing's work. He says he needs to consider the most excellent habit, the best virtue of each part, because this perfects the proper operation of each part. When it guarantees that an action is performed in the best way with highest virtual quantity or quality of perfection, this habit would be best, a maximum of intensity in greatness, in quality. To determine the proper operation of each part, he considers the end, the good of each part. Regarding the intellectual part, Aristotle says two activities are proper to man, the rational animal: knowing the truth and self-mastered action. And three principles of the soul have mastery over these two activities: the intellect, the senses, and the appetites. Neither the senses nor the sense appetite are psychological principles of truth. The senses considered as such, not the sense appetite, play no essential role in generating self-mastered, emotionally self-controlled moral actions, at least not strictly speaking. Okay? While other animals have senses, according to St. Thomas and Aristotle, these animals do not generate moral interaction because they lack an intrinsic principle of voluntary activity, intrinsic power to deliberate. They are not rational, used in the medieval definition, rational animals in the sense that they're not deliberating animals. They lack the power to do this. The intellect and appetitive faculty can achieve a kind of unity and harmony and peace, which you don't find in animals, inasmuch as what the intellect declares good or bad, the appetitive faculty pursues as far as the good, and it avoids as far as the bad. This harmony, as I said, is not found in other animals because they don't have this conflict. The appetitive faculty and intellect can so harmonize because they have proportionate, complementary, relatable or analogous powers. The intellect has two chief operations in judging, St. Thomas says. Affirmation, by which it asserts, accepts, is receptive to what is true, and negation, by which it dissents from, rejects or resists what is false. Analogously, proportionately, these two acts correspond to two acts of the appetitive faculty to tend to adhere to the good and flee and withdraw from, dissent from the bad, resist it. In moral choice, moral activity, these actions of the intellect and appetite harmonize, they cooperate. St. Thomas calls choice the appetitive faculty deliberating, because choice acts on what has been rationally preconsidered. Choice, as he sees it, is the concurrence of reason and appetite, an act of the intellect commanding and prescribing action. For choice to be good, what reason commands must be true, and the appetitive faculty must be right. What reason declares as true, the appetitive faculty pursues as good. This harmony, that is, exists between the two of them, making the choice prudential. In speculative knowing, the absolutely abstractly considered true is good, the false is bad. The good of the practical intellect is not abstract conformity, harmonization of the intellect with what is. It's concrete conformity of the truth with a right appetite, a prudentially rightly guided appetite, an act of the intellect conforming to right desire. Choice is essentially an act of the intellect commanding and of the appetite consenting. Man is a principle of moral choice. If truth of the practical intellect is determined by conformity with right desire, and right desire is determined by the fact that it agrees with right reason, prudence, conforming with fulfilling real human needs, man's end is determined by nature, not by choice. Rectitude of the appetitive faculty, St. Thomas adds, to fulfilling real human needs as determined by human nature is the measure of truth, the chief measure of truth for practical reason. It's the specific, the precise prescription. A moral virtue is a habit of free choice. As a voluntary activity, free choice is directed toward real means that actually fulfill natural needs. The truth of practical reason, means that actually satisfy real human needs, is the precise, the specific rule of rectitude for the appetitive faculty, its measure. Hence, the appetitive faculty is called right inasmuch as it pursues the means that reason calls true, suitable, fitting, and proportioned. Like the speculative intellect, the practical intellect starts its reasoning from a universal consideration, a consideration of a generic subject, but it terminates its reasoning in an individual doable deed, in a something done. Both universal and particular reason have a relation to action. Particular reason specifies the action that universal reason in a universal way commands. The intellect is a principle of action, according to St. Thomas, in judging and in choosing what is and choosing what can be, because it's actual, the means to an end. Choice is the appetitive faculty commanding action after deliberation. As such, it is an efficient cause of action, an efficient principle of action. Choice is the appetitive faculty ordered to a means, commanded by reason as suitable for this or that end. If the act of choice, reason, proposes the end and subsequently starts to deliberate about means to achieve this end, that the appetite consents to the end and does not consent to the end or means, choice as a cause, and the appetite of faculty being commanded, cooperating in the cause, are compared. The effect of choice in action, good or evil action, cannot exist without comparing, without the deliberating intellect, to some extent, to some inclination existing in the appetitive faculty. While the human intellect is a principle of action, in and of itself, the speculative intellect moves nothing other than itself, because, according to St. Thomas, the speculative intellect prescribes and commands nothing about pursuit and flight. The intellect as a principle of action is an intellect intent on achieving an end, on generating an individual action or thing as an end. Aristotle gives us an example of the productive arts of the builder, constructing a house for use as a shelter. This is a concrete individual product, not an abstract one, for a concrete individual end. In moral activity, in the individual situation, choices, prudence, arranges successive acts of the appetitive faculty as means to an end of perfect operation. Enumerating the intellectual virtues, Aristotle continues to a discussion about how every science can be taught. He starts to examine the particular intellectual virtues by first defining intellectual virtues as habits by which the soul expresses the truth, by affirming or denying. These habits are wisdom, science, understanding, prudence, and art. Starting with science, Aristotle says it's a habit, perfecting the intellect regarding necessary things, regarding necessary judgments it makes about necessary things. To know with certainty is proper to science because, properly speaking, science is the best form of knowledge. The best form of knowledge knows with certainty. Only the necessary, what can be in only one way, removes doubt. Without qualification, the subject of a science is the unchangeable and the necessary, strictly speaking. St. Thomas claims that even a science of the producible and the perishable, like physics, can exist, but they cannot be based upon contingent particulars subject to generation and destruction. Something about them must be necessary and unchanging. They must be based upon universal, necessary, and eternal principles that some way exist in them. Explaining science by its cause, Aristotle says that every science seems teachable. Every knowable thing can be learned by a man with the ability. All teaching and science must arise from some prior knowledge. We cannot arrive at knowledge of some yet unknown thing, he adds, except by some known thing. By means of things known, a twofold teaching exists. By induction, by which we understand some principle and some universal, at which we arrive by experience of singulars, and by syllogism, which proceeds from universal principles known by induction. Induction is a principle of the syllogism. Not every syllogism, however, generates knowledge and causes science. Only the demonstrative syllogism generates science. Hence, science is a habit caused by demonstration. To have science, first principles of knowledge must exist, must be known by a scientist, be assented to and understood better than the conclusion, because the cause must be more powerful than the effect, must be of greater intensive or quantity or quality. That which causes science must be known more than science. Two habits perfect the intellect regarding contingent things. Prudence, what is to be done, and art, what is to be made. And what is to be done also includes performance arts other than prudence, although St. Thomas and Aristotle do not mention it here. A habit that through reason causes action, prudence, is not identical with a habit that through reason produces things, like makes a house. They have different formal objects, different chief objects of interest. After considering the nature of art, next Aristotle starts to examine the nature of prudence by saying he will do so by studying the behavior of people we call prudent. The prudent man, he says, gives good advice about proper and proportionate, useful goods in some particular matter. This is the prudent man or prudent person in particular, or for the benefit of the total life of a human being, the absolutely prudent person. Prudent people assume the end is good, just like dentists assume that teeth exist. To make deductions, correct inferences about things means useful for an evil end is contrary to prudence because it's contrary to its formal object. To start defining prudence through negation, Aristotle observes that no one deliberates about things that are unchangeable and beyond our power. Notice how this brings prudential deliberation within the domain, the area of consideration of the estimative sense or cogitative or particular reason. From this, Aristotle concludes that strictly speaking, prudence cannot be science, speculative science, because demonstration causes science. Prudence, considering a subject whose principles are not rigid, somewhat variable, flexible, is strict demonstration in prudence, in prudential matters, is not possible. Prudence is about giving good advice regarding changeable matters worthy of deliberation, about concrete actions to take in variable situations, not simply to reason to conclusion from premises. So in an extended sense, in an analogous sense, the prudential can be called scientific, but not strictly speaking, because the kind of right reasoning involved is not exactly the same as in speculative science, which is the chief mode of science according to Aristotle. Prudence and art cannot be identical because they are different intellectual acts. Prudence studies the genus of action. It terminates in action. Art studies the genus of making. It terminates in a product, most of the time at least. As I've said, sometimes art, fine arts, for example, performance arts, terminate in action and not in moral actions or prudential actions. Knowledge of contingent beings cannot possess true certainty in rejecting falsehood, cannot perfect the intellect as a speculative kind of knowing can. They can perfect the intellect, however, as commanding, controlling, prescribing the useful, directing human acts to satisfy ends, which is an act of the intellect, and essential to it, natural to it. Art, Aristotle says, is a habit concerned with making something through reason. Every productive habit directed by reason is art. Two parts included in art's subject matter are the product manufactured and the act of the craftsman that the art directs. A threefold operation exists in art. To consider how to make something, to work on an external material, and to finish the work, the end of the art. Art is also concerned with preparatory work, with qualifying the material and observing how art may make something. Two things need to be considered about productive arts on the part of the work. That products can be and not be, are contingent, are improvable, and the principle of artistic creativity exists in the artist alone as intrinsic. In the thing made, it exists as something extrinsic, as an instrument. Art differs from metaphysics and mathematics, physics and prudence. Metaphysics and math, he says, consider causes existing in subject studies. Physics studies causes of motion intrinsic to the subject. And art gives directions for making. Prudence gives directions for action. Prudence is a habit concerned with action, with things good and bad for human beings, healthy and unhealthy for them. It is a habit concerned with causing human actions, actions that perfect human beings and our ability to satisfy real human needs. For example, the chief aim end, the last act at which a general contractor aims, is a building, an edifice external to the builder. This is because general contracting is a productive art. The chief aim, the last act, end at which prudence aims, is excellent action, perfect operation, internal to the human agent. This is because prudence is a performance art. Other performance art also exists. Prudence aims at perfecting human nature. We think of political leaders and people who can estimate well about what is good for themselves and others as examples of prudent individuals. In Greek, prudence is named phronesis, reasoning, and temperance is named sophrosune, derived from phronesis, preserving reasoning. Precisely by moderating pleasure and pains of touch and temperance, Aristotle maintains we preserve a right estimation of good acts to be done and bad acts to be performed. While pleasure and pain have less of an impact on right reason related to speculative judgment, St. Thomas notes that they tend to have a major impact on right reason related precisely to estimating what needs to be done and avoided in practical matters in the individual situation. This impact happens because in practical actions, an end, what is best in the genus, is the last act, the one act for which all the other acts are done, the final act that all the other acts exist cooperatively to generate, for which they do everything they do. For a person experience intense pleasure and pain, as we can tell from our own experience. The judgment of what is really best is distorted in the intemperate person. As a result, the judgment of the intemperate man does not see clearly the end, the doable act, which is the first principle of prudence. Does not see this chiefly as a real end, the real end to be desired. The intemperate man takes his eye off the ball, as we would say. He loses focus through a loss of appetitive strength to relate to that end. And this causes this person to reason badly in the individual situation, to lose focus on the proper concepts involved, to choose and do everything as a means to satisfy his real end no longer appears necessary to the intemperate man. Like every moral vice, bad habit, the imprudent judgment of the intemperate man distorts apprehension of the real end, as well as means to achieving it, because it distorts right estimation, sensing of it, right desire for it. From what he has said thus far about prudence, Aristotle concludes it is necessarily a habit of action directed by right reason to the real good of man. Every productive art and other performance art depends upon prudence, not so it can fulfill its nature, considered as such, but rightly to regulate its use, to preserve its principles, which include the natural abilities of the performer, and the ends toward which those acts are ordered, these gradually become disordered by habitual exercise of imprudent choice. While a general contractor might have the ability to construct a good building, the vice of intemperance might cause him to become lazy and not do well what he is able by the art to do. Numerous examples of this exist with respect in our own day to athletes, to movie stars, to investment bankers, to people who all of a sudden acquire great wealth and can't handle it. A moral virtue, justice, might intervene in some instances and cause such people to start to use their art out of a sense of duty, or perhaps a friend in need. But at times, these do not help them out. After an art is acquired, the artist must still exercise moral virtue to regulate right use of the art. So it acts as a kind of necessary but not sufficient condition for maintaining the art. The art itself acts in this way too. It has to have prudence. It has to be exercised within the context of a moral culture to be preserved and perfected. After prudence is acquired, additional moral virtue is needed to regulate its right use, because prudence is essentially joined to directing moral virtues that preserve real human goods. In other words, the virtues of courage and the virtues of temperance and justice are rightly ordered to the end. They're rightly inclined toward it. They're not perfectly possessed until prudence is added, but prudence needs them to be able to regulate human action in perfect right use. For the principles of prudence to be preserved, rectitude of the appetitive faculties concerning real ends, fulfilling real needs, right desires, must be preserved. And these for these we need these other moral virtues. The moral virtues preserve this right desire in the appetites for the right ends. Hence St. Thomas says prudence is not an art consisting only of knowing a truth of reason. It's a moral virtue requiring rectitude of appetite, like that possessed by moral virtue. Consequently, he says, even though it's an intellectual virtue, prudence is an intellectual virtue by participation, secundum quid, existing in intellect in the estimative and conjectural part of the soul as in a subject. Unlike art, it is not an act of reason alone, connected to reason alone. It's a cooperative act of reason and appetite, of right estimation and right desire. St. Thomas concludes his treatment of prudence by saying that cessation of right desire, not lack of use, causes prudence to be lost and forgotten. So long as right desire exists, it's engaged with things belonging to prudence. Prudence, in principle at least, exists within an agent. That is, with the desire to fulfill real human needs, prudence is not totally forgotten. We left off last time talking about intellectual virtues. We're going to continue with intellectual virtues, focusing in this lecture on understanding chiefly, and also wisdom. After examining the intellectual habits of right reason, through which the intellect is perfected, St. Thomas says Aristotle next considers intellectual first principles presupposed by right reason in all its species. You recall he was talking about, for example, last time, art and science. And he's talking here regarding understanding, from which demonstrative reason, science, is generated, and wisdom, from which all other principles of right reason are, to some extent, derived. He says that science is a judgment about universals, and the necessary, the unchanging. The particular and the contingent do not attain scientific certainty because they fall under the apprehension of the senses. So strictly speaking, they are not scientific, but in a way they are. Okay? Some principles of science necessarily involve demonstrable conclusions. They're founded on them. because the demonstrative reason proceeds from principles to conclusions. It's founded on principles. Hence, the principle of demonstrative science is not prudence, an art. It's not a prudence, an art, a science, even metaphysics. The first principles of demonstrative science, that is, the first principles of demonstration, not the first principles of being, which metaphysics considers, must be undemonstrated, undemonstrable causes. They cannot proceed to infinity. They cannot be contingent beings. And they have to be what we know best, what is best known to us. Art and prudence cannot provide the principles of demonstrative science because the subject they consider are contingent beings and some beings. They are not what we know best. They are not all beings. Metaphysics cannot provide these principles because the metaphysician starts reasoning from indemonstrable principles, using reasoning to arrive at first principles of being. The metaphysician uses first principles of reasoning to start with. Since whether they consider necessary or contingent subjects, no falsehood can be a first principle of an intellectual science. And since prudence, art, science, wisdom are virtues of right reason, the intellectual virtue of understanding grasps the first principles of all other intellectual virtues. Just as with respect to reasoning about anything, we first have to know that something is. The dentist, for example, cannot reason about how to fix your teeth unless the dentist first knows what teeth are. We first must know something before we can reason about anything, and what we first know is a principle. So by understanding, St. Thomas says, he does not mean the human intellect considers as a faculty. He means a particular habit of the intellect by which a man, in virtue of the light of the active intellect, the agent intellect, this faculty he says we possess, naturally and immediately understands principles from a knowledge of their terms. Principles like every whole is greater than any of its parts, or the principle of non-contradiction. If we do not know these evidently to be true, we cannot start reasoning. This is why St. Thomas says we have a faculty of understanding, by means of which we immediately know these to be true, just by knowing what their terms, whole and part, mean, for example. Note that the essence of the thing is the truth of a thing. It's the proper object of the human intellect through which we know even the existence of something. Unless we relate it to the essence, we can't even know the existence of something. Having considered the virtue of understanding, Aristotle next considers wisdom in a qualified sense and an unqualified or absolute sense. He says wisdom in a qualified sense is the highest excellence of knowing in any art or science, the maximum of perfection in an art or science. Among arts, and architectonically arranged, it's the art whose principles direct and command lower arts, like sailing commands shipbuilding. In an unqualified sense, wisdom considers principles of being. This is the way metaphysics does. Principles, beings most knowable in themselves, but at first least knowable to us on the sense level. The science of wisdom is the most certain science because all modes of knowing, because it considers all modes of knowing, because it knows the first principles of all being, not just of demonstration. And it judges about these principles to explain them, to make them more intelligible, not to prove them, but to declare their truth and defend them against those who attempt to deny them. As such, it's the perfection of all sciences. After defining the individual virtues, St. Thomas, says Aristotle, considers wisdom as the chief intellectual virtue, the principal intellectual virtue. He shows why it must be the chief intellectual virtue and the highest science. It's no ordinary science. It's the science of the most honorable things, beings of the highest intensive quantity. He doesn't say this, but this is the way I put it. Of greatness in being, of the highest qualitative good. It considers divine things. For St. Thomas, this is not chiefly the subject, which it considers. For Aristotle, it is. But for St. Thomas, it chiefly considers substance and all the different types of beings or substances and their principles. Within its nature, in some way, as the chief of all sciences, it contains all the principles of all the sciences. Just as the senses located in the human head direct all the movements of other bodily parts. Because all other sciences take their principles from it, wisdom directs all the other sciences. Is the command and control science, I would say, of all sciences. Philosophers who maintain that political science, which governs the multitude, and prudence, which governs a single man, who claim that this is the highest science, or this prudence or political science is the highest science, St. Thomas says are wrong. No science of use can be the highest science, the best science. Sciences of use, recall, by nature are architectonically ordered to serve sciences of performance, facultative operations. The best science has as its subject the best of all subjects, the best of all goods, the best of all beings, the most perfect nature in the world, according to St. Thomas. It's the being, as I would put it, of highest intensive quantity, or greatest intensive quantity, the being of greatest qualitative goodness, the most perfect of beings in existence. Since man is not the best of all things, Aristotle maintains political science cannot be the highest science. Some things exist whose nature consists chiefly in proportion and relation to another. Such things exist in unequal proportion, relation to other things, in unequal intensity and quality and perfection. For example, health and good do not exist with equal perfection and possession in human beings and fishes, St. Thomas says. Such things are predicated unequally and analogously according to unequal relation of the subject that possesses them. Other things are predicated according to equal relation of their subjects, or to their subjects, univocally, like white of colors, straight of figures, he gives as an example. You might also say of human nature of both Plato and Socrates. The divine things, in which wisdom resides as a nature, chiefly for Aristotle, is wisdom in this sense. It's always the same. It's predicated univocally. Wisdom is the science of first principles of all being. In other words, Aristotle is saying that just as when we say human nature of Plato and Socrates, we say it univocally, so when we say that contradictory opposites cannot simultaneously be true, we are not predicating that analogously. We are saying that univocally. But prudence, which exists in finite things, is predicated relationally according to unequal power of receiving the subject of which it is said. That is, of the unequal power of the subject to be related to prudential judgment. For example, men of different levels of prudence and men of other animals, for example, and other animals, other than the human being, are said in some way to be prudent. If a science were wisdom, since many sciences exist, many wisdoms would exist, and political science would be a wisdom. But as Aristotle has said, no science, no prudence, individual prudence, can be wisdom, nor can many other things. Wisdom, metaphysics, studies unchanging principles without qualification that are common to all beings. Politics studies somewhat variable principles of human communities. It cannot be wisdom considered in an unqualified sense. It cannot be prudence. Even though man is the most excellent of animals, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, and especially according to St. Thomas, God and separated substances are more excellent, and they are the principle of lower bodies. Remember, separated substances for Aristotle, St. Thomas would also include angels here, but separated substances for Aristotle exist in connection with an everlasting matter and are incorruptible. So he's talking about things like the planets. Analogous to the intellectual virtues of science and understanding, wisdom is science and understanding of the most honorable beings, the highest principles, as Aristotle sees it. Wisdom considers goods better than human beings. Prudence considers human goods. For this reason, St. Thomas and Aristotle point out that people like Thales and Anaxagoras, who the ancients considered to be wise, were very often made fun of for not being prudential. For Thales, for example, for falling into a pit while walking, looking up at the stars, and Anaxagoras for not being interested in money making, but being interested more in speculation. Deliberating well is the work of prudence, not demonstrative science. It's not the work of wisdom. The prudent man without qualification is a good counselor, someone who can estimate, and note the term, estimate, by reasoning what is the best to do. Prudence is located in particular reason, the estimative sense. It considers both universals, in which action does not occur, and singulars, principles of action, because prudence is a principle of action. For example, it considers the universal principle, do good and avoid evil, but it also notes what is good in the individual circumstance, this. And so you should do this, not that. Since action chiefly has to do with singulars, knowledge of singular principles of action are more crucial to know than universal principles in relationship to prudence. But since prudence is right reason concerning an action, the prudent man needs a knowledge of both. If you don't know that by nature you are supposed to do good, inclined to do good and avoid evil, then you can have no prudential knowledge. And this awareness, by the way, as I am convinced, exists on the level of the estimative sense. This is where we first experience it in relationship to universal reason, too. It's an operation of both. While wisdom is the chief intellectual virtue, St. Thomas says prudence is chief in human affairs. While wisdom does not consist of knowledge of human affairs, a kind of architectonic command and control reason exists in prudence. He and Aristotle define prudence and civic prudence as right plans or ordering of action of things to be done in relation to what is good or bad for one human being or for a civic multitude. Civic prudence is to prudence, St. Thomas says, as legal justice is to individual justice. In between civic prudence and individual prudence, St. Thomas Aristotle locates domestic or household prudence, which helps us to determine, civic prudence helps us to determine the good to do for others, whereas prudence helps us determine the good to do for ourselves as individuals. Civic prudence, he says, is divided into two parts. The whole state that dealing with doable deeds by individuals, as well as by individuals in this as part of the civic individuals. The dealing with the whole state, it's called architectonic or legislative prudence, determining for others what to do. It's the kind of prudence that a legislator has. Rulers in imposing laws, according to St. Thomas, resemble architects. Hence, positive law is called architectonic prudence, right reason according to which rulers frame just laws. Dealing with doable deeds, civic prudence involves laws that are compared to doable deeds as universals to particulars. They frame in an abstract way doable activities, not impossible activities, because those would be fundamentally unjust. Similarly, legislative prudence frames the law, and civic prudence, dealing with doable deeds, puts into effect and conserves what the law prescribes. Executive civic prudence is simply the application of universal reason to some particular doable deed, which would have to occur through the estimative or particular reason. St. Thomas doesn't say that, he nudges Aristotle, but I add it because it's correct from their reasoning. As a legal decree is called a decree only in relation to a doable deed, that is, do this, don't do that, and you know it to be possible. The decree it relates to a singular precept. A decree concerns a singular extreme or a limit about which it is operative and deliberative. Do this. In the individual case, St. Thomas repeatedly refers to an extreme as a principle, to distinguish it from a principle as some kind of a general starting point for regulating thinking, reasoning, or behavior. But it's basically a principle, just put in different terms. St. Thomas says the individual legal decree is called a singular extreme. That is, it's a principle, but related to a certain type of act. Because our knowledge starts from it. That is, it's a starting point. It proceeds to the universal reason, which understands the universal principle like do good, avoid evil, and then terminates by way of descent in an individual act commanding, do this, because this is good. Do good, avoid evil, this is good, do this. It's also called a singular extreme because it applies a universally, abstractly stated law, once again, do good, avoid evil, to a singular doable deed, and does not command the impossible. Since only those who execute the enacted laws are active in civic affairs, analogously, Aristotle compares them to manual workers who execute architectural plans. He compares legislators to architects. While both legislative and executive civic prudence are acts of prudence, personal prudence, Aristotle says, is especially prudence, is prudence absolutely. The other types of prudence, household and domestic, civic, legislative, executive prudence, are prudence secundum quid in a secondary sense. Analogously, each species of prudence is divided into two parts, consultative and judicial, or juridical, judicial. St. Thomas states that prudence exists not only in reason, in universal and particular reason, but also in the appetites. He doesn't specifically say that in this passage I'm referring to, but that's what he means. He adds that all species of prudence he has mentioned are species of prudence to the extent that They do not exist in reason alone, but to some extent in the appetite. If these aforementioned activities exist only in reason, their proper name, he says, is practical science or domestic ethics politics. That is, they're speculative, and named more to reflect their speculative nature. Since a whole is of greater priority than a part, the city than a household, and a household than one man, civic prudence must be of greatest import, must be of greater import than domestic prudence. Domestic prudence must be of greater import than personal prudence, and legislative prudence is of greater import among the parts of civic prudence. Absolutely of greatest import among acts that a human being must perform. In reply to an objection that only a man who cultivates things having to do with himself appears prudent, and those who devote themselves with concerns of the multitude appear lacking in prudence, Aristotle gives the example of a soldier in a play of Euripides who asks how he could be prudent when he neglects care of himself. In reply to this, Aristotle in St. Thomas says the good of the part cannot be attained without the good of the whole. Individual good cannot be attained without domestic and civic prudence. At the same time, without personal prudence, civic and domestic prudence are insufficient, even with them in place. How to dispose personal affairs is not evident. St. Thomas clarifies his argument by saying prudence is concerned with universals and particulars, as I've already explained. Prudence is he says, evidence of this, a special nature of prudence, is that while young people can excel in speculative sciences like geometry and arithmetic, they do not appear able to be prudent. The particulars that prudence must know demand experience, which young people do not have. Aristotle explains that because we know the principles of mathematics by abstraction from sensible objects of observation, because we can know them more or less immediately through the imagination without a lot of time and experience, the principle that they are more easily known by young people. But the principles of physics and metaphysics have to be studied by experience for a long time to grasp. The act of abstraction that they require involves more experience and experimentation in respect to something like physics, for example. Youth easily understand what the imagination grasps, but they have a difficult time understanding what exceeds the power of the external senses, of the imagination. The shortness of their lives, St. Thomas says, causes them to lack the training to do so. Prudence is especially complex because its work, deliberating well, is the subject of a twofold mistake. One concerns the universal. For example, whether the statement that all non-running waters are unhealthy is true. And the other concerns the particular, whether this water is non-running. In addition, prudence has to give direction regarding universals and particulars. Since science, speculative science, considers universals, and it's the nature of the practical to be particular, evident to St. Thomas is that prudence is not science in the sense of speculative science. It's only science in an analogous and extended way. But you'll note he and Aristotle repeatedly talk of practical science in relationship to prudence, ethics, and even refer at times to activities like artistic activities. Comparing prudence to understanding, St. Thomas says that both science and prudence are receptive of contact with, they have some agreement with understanding as a habit of principles. Understanding concerns indemonstrable principles, extremes, for which no proof exists. The principles, the singular extremes, the doable deeds cannot be proved by reason, but they are immediately known by themselves, but only known to the person who has reached the level of particular reason and has enough experience to know that these are doable deeds. He said, and once again, that's my addition, he says that prudence is concerned with the singular doable deeds, a singular doable deed that must be taken as a principle of things to be done. He adds that no scientific knowledge exists for this singular doable deed because no scientific knowledge exists for singular terms, extremes of a relation. No scientific knowledge exists for one of the sense faculties and what it knows. This singular extreme is not apprehended by the external sense faculty as a proper sensible. It doesn't apprehend the doable deed. This is apprehended by the inner sense faculty, the estimative sense, through which we perceive the sensibly imaginable, like the triangle. Then St. Thomas states, and this is crucial, that prudence perfects particular reason, rightly to judge singular relations, that to know doable deeds. Even brute animals endowed with a natural estimative power, he says, are called prudence. The sense that has the ability to distinguish among proper sensibles, the common sense, perfects knowing by apprehending differences between proper sensibles like colors and flavors and so on. But prudence agrees with understanding in that it considers the extreme terms of a relationship, these starting points. It differs from understanding in that understanding does not incline toward inquiry, whereas prudence inclines toward deliberation, which is a kind of inquiry. It's like this. Is this doable? Is it doable by me? Is it doable by me now? To make more precise the nature of prudence, Aristotle examines virtues connected to closely resembling prudence. He focuses attention on one especially called excellence in deliberating, or euboulia in Greek. The person with a euboulia is a person who inquires well, and Aristotle starts to identify what this virtue is and how prudence is related to it negatively. Because euboulia is a kind of deliberation connected to inquiry, it's not science. So negatively, Aristotle says, well, it can't be science, euboulia, because people with science are certain, and they do not inquire about what they know. For two reasons, he adds, euboulia is not eustochia, which today we would call, I think, lucky guessing, being a good guesser. Because lucky guessing is instantaneous. It exists without rational inquiry, is innate in some human beings who are able quickly to judge. They have acute knowing powers, rich imaginations, sensitive external senses which enable them quickly to judge a situation, to estimate it. St. Thomas says it also exists in people with a lot of experience. Euboulia takes time, however, to develop. It involves slow deliberation. Then St. Thomas presents the proverb, matters of prudence should be deliberated slowly beforehand, but executed quickly. The second reason euboulia is not eustochia, lucky guessing, is that if they were identical, they would have no differences. Being quick of mind is a species of eustochia, which is rapid guessing about the means opinion to an end. People in business, for example, have this skill. People in a lot of practical activities display it. Eubulia is a kind of deliberation. Eustochia is a kind of opinion, one quickly given, it's fixed in judgment, and it involves no deliberation. Eubulia is a kind of right deliberation, not a kind of science or opinion. Opinion, St. Thomas calling a declaration of what one imagines to be true, or suspects, use the term suspects at times, related to that. Aristotle maintains that we predicate the term rectitude analogously in four senses, which he's going to apply to Eubulia. Properly of good things and figuratively of bad things. For example, properly we predicate rightness of a person who is honest, but we could call somebody a great burglar, a good burglar, knows how to do it well, rightly. We also use rectitude of the end, of the means, and the manner in which we approach the means. The rectitude of Eubulia is of good things, not of bad, like that of the burglar, that attains a good end, of right means, that is done in the right way, in the right manner, toward the proper end, and at the right time, and about right, qualified or unqualified ends. St. Thomas concludes from the preceding analysis that Eubulia is right deliberation about an abstractly good end, an end conceived abstractly or considered abstractly by suitable means at the right time. So it contains the four properties of rectitude he's just talked about, which prudence will also contain as a kind of Eubulia. St. Thomas is emphasizing that in talking about these closely resembling qualities, Aristotle and St. Thomas are indicating that prudence involves three chief characteristics: being able to inquire well, being able to judge well, and being able to command well. So after considering focusing on Eubulia, they focus on this habit called synesis. After showing how Eubulia involves rightness of investigation, rightness of inquiry, he distinguishes synesis, common sense, from scientific knowledge and opinion. We have derivatively the term asinine today for a person who's lacking common sense, who lacks synesis. And synesis, as far as I can see, resembles in a certain way, Eustochia, which we've talked about. He says that while all human beings have some science and opinion, not all human beings have what we call common sense. If synesis and knowledge and opinion were identical, all human beings would have common sense. Synesis is no particular science. For example, it's not medicine, physics, or metaphysics. It concerns matters about which we can doubt and deliberate. And prudence also involves matters about which we can debate and deliberate and doubt. So they resemble one another in relationship to judgments, not investigation. To make the idea of synesis more precise, Aristotle compares it to speculative matters. Speculative matters, he says, investigate and judge. While Eubulia investigates well, synesis judges well about matters, about which we have deliberated and investigated well. Unlike speculative reason, which concludes in judging, St. Thomas says that practical reason investigates like Eubulia, judges like synesis, and commands, which is distinctive to prudence. Unlike synesis, which is descriptive, prudence is prescriptive. Synesis is right judgment about what happens in the majority of cases. It resembles judgment of legal justice. These qualities that Aristotle is focusing on, investigation, judging, and commanding, are qualities that he identifies with a just judge. So what he's doing is he's focusing attention on the qualities that we would consider a just judge to possess, and placing them as within the habits of the prudent man. The synesis resembles nome, a right judgment about the equitable, what a right judge happens. Prudence combines right investigation with right judgment, found in both legal justice and equity, a kind of compassion, ability to adjust in the individual's circumstance to determine the right choice. To these it adds the quality of commanding well. Like prudence, synesis and nome consider individual extremes limits as starting points. Like science, deliberation presupposes understanding. Understanding, according to St. Thomas, occurs both in speculative and practical knowledge. It considers first principles and singular extremes from which reasoning starts. So within the particular reason, in fact, particular reason itself is identified by St. Thomas as the faculty of understanding, just like the virtue of understanding in speculative science. Within the estimated power, there's also a faculty of understanding, from which we get first principles about singulars, the doable deed. It's here that is located, strictly speaking, the first principle of natural law, do good and avoid evil. The estimative sense has to be involved in generating that understanding. So, two kinds of understanding exist, the speculative and the practical about the singular and contingent. These principles of what is to be done, the means for an end, are those of the practical understanding. Evidence, St. Thomas says, is that because we take our understanding of universals from singulars, singulars have to have the nature of principles. For example, we conclude that this herb has the universal power, that is, it's a causal universal, to cure from the fact that this herb cures this man. This is a kind of mnemonically grasped universal that we apprehend on the level of the estimative faculty. And we recall in relationship to individual times. Every time this has been done, this is what has happened. Because we know these singular first principles through the senses, we need to have experience of these singulars, which St. Thomas calls principles and extremes. We have to know these by both the exterior and the interior sense. Immediately, and this is crucial to note, St. Thomas adds that prudence belongs to the sensory power of judgment called particular reason. He adds that since that the particular reason whose object is sensible and singular is called understanding. He even calls particular reason understanding, like as a faculty, rather than as a habit within the faculty, which it also possesses. He adds that since the habits of eubulia, inquiring well, and synesis, judging well, and nome, also involved in judging well, prudence, which commands well, concerns singulars. Since this is the case, they must in some way be in contact with the sensitive faculties which operate by means of bodily organs, so that we are able to know human abilities. This appears to be natural, not in the sense that they are entirely from nature, but in the sense that some human beings are inclined to them by a natural physical disposition so as to be perfected in them with little experience. St. Thomas adds that such a disposition does not happen with speculative intellectual habits like geometry and metaphysics, which consider physical natures. And natures that also can be non-physical in the case of metaphysics. No one, he says, is born wise, a metaphysician or a geometrician. While some men are naturally more apt to develop these habits, this disposition is more remote, intellectual, than the proximate disposition for synesis, nome, or sense understanding. St. Thomas says that an indication of this sensory aptitude for these habits is that they tend to happen in old age, after intense bodily changes have ceased. Common sense and understanding appear to come to a human being as if nature caused them. From what he has said, St. Thomas infers that particular reason, understanding in practical matters, like speculative understanding, concerns principles, but does so as a kind of end. He says that in speculative matters, demonstration proceeds from principles considered by understanding, but no demonstration exists of these principles. In practical matters, demonstration also proceeds from principles, and demonstration exists for these principles. I suppose he means by speculative reason, but I think it also is the case through practical application when we see failure, for example, or success. In practical argumentation, which essentially involves reason commanding action, the major premise is do good and avoid evil. The minor is a singular. This is good. The conclusion is do this, which infers the practical act to be done. So strictly speaking, it's not a syllogism, but it's somewhat like one. From the preceding, St. Thomas concludes that the perfection of particular reason, understanding, which deals with practical principles, means to an end, follows from age and experience. Note that ethics is education, then, of particular reason, in its final perfection. This is what it aims at achieving, among other things. I say this, St. Thomas doesn't note it here. Hence, in practical matters, we must pay attention to the opinions and decisions of the experienced, the elderly, and prudent men. While such opinions, decisions do not lead to demonstrations, they lead to something more important, Thomas says, in practical matters, principles. Just as in universal principles, or just as involving universal principles, abstract judgment about them belongs to understanding and deductions from such principles to conclusions. So, in particulars, absolute judgment about them belongs to particular reason, understanding of the particular. Prudence is achieved as a result of a progression from synesis to nome and to eubulia. And these belong to particular reason, which concludes from one of these to the other. In conclusion, wisdom, the chief virtue of speculative matters, and prudence, the chief virtue in practical matters, exist, Thomas tells us, in different parts of the soul. He notes that some possible objections people might raise about the utility of wisdom and prudence for human life. Next. He says, one was that since wisdom considers first principles of being and does not consider first principles of operation, it appears useless to making us happy. In relationship to prudence, someone might object, prudence considers actions by which we might become happy. As such, it appears unnecessary. And in a habit of inclination, not knowledge, the concern of prudence moves a person to perform noble and honorable and useful goods toward himself and just good toward others. Notice this, how St. Thomas has identified the act of prudence to involve a knowledge of justice as well as the honorable, of the higher good over the lower as well as the just goods, and having the knowledge to do justice as well as these individual virtues. It's a knowledge of all virtue. While in some cases, from a knowledge of his art, an artist acts well, such actions are incidental, this person can argue. The habit of the act, not knowledge, generates the good of the act. It's somewhat like a basketball player doing something apparently without knowledge, but just by habit. Since virtues are habits, the habits, not prudence, induce a man to do good. So it's said, or argued. Aristotle rejects one possible reply to the critique of prudence just given. Someone might answer that prudence is needed to become virtuous, not to do virtuous deeds, by saying, because prudence would not be useful to human beings when we're already good. This reply appears to be unreasonable. Because to become virtuous, we need not be prudent. We need instruction, Aristotle says, in answer, by prudent men or prudent people. He rejects another reply that questions the superiority of wisdom to prudence, which claims, while wisdom appears superior to prudence in excellence because it considers universal principles of being, while prudence concerns singular operations, political science, a species of prudence, gives orders about what sciences should be pursued in a state and a man should learn, as well as the length of education. Since to give orders is the function of a judge and of a superior, prudence appears to have authority over wisdom. The less perfect should have authority over the more perfect appears unreasonable. Aristotle's reply to this objection occurs within the context of resolving general doubts about the usefulness of prudence and wisdom in the following way. So it takes him a while to get back to giving an answer to these two objections. He says that even if prudence and wisdom added no proximate utility to directing habits of choice, they would perfect both parts of the rational soul by being objects of choice, because some perfection causes any object to be an object of choice. You should note that. It's part of the formal object of an object of choice, recognizing something more perfect. Wisdom, prudence actually do contribute something toward happiness. He says that wisdom and prudence contribute what they contribute. Okay, he continues. He says that, let me check my pages. Yes, I got it. Okay. In considering what prudence contributes to human happiness, he says the analogy with art fails because art generates a good in an external thing, whereas prudence, wisdom, like health, generate their good in the faculties of the person. Happiness is no externally generated product. It's an internally caused operation generated by virtue. Wisdom's a species of virtue, considered as a whole. Hence, a man who has wisdom and acts according to it is happy. A man who has prudence and acts according to it is happy. Regarding the objections about prudence contributing nothing to happiness, he says both prudence and moral virtue perfect the work of virtue. In a work of virtue, we need two things: right desire for the end that moral virtue provides, and right reason about the means which prudence provides, which includes taking delight in the right means. In morally virtuous operation, a concurrence of moral virtue and prudence exists. Prudence cannot exist without virtue, according to St. Thomas and Aristotle, and moral virtue cannot exist without moral virtue, and moral virtue cannot exist without prudence. Moral virtue without prudence is not moral virtue. It's not complete moral virtue, and vice versa. For total moral virtue to exist, two operative principles, right desire and right reason, must exist. Not everyone who does just acts, St. Thomas notes, even habitually, is morally virtuous. For example, when we do just acts under force of law, ignorance, or personal gain, to be morally virtuous, a person must know and love the just, temperate, and courageous deed. Take delight in doing it. More than right intention for the end is needed to be morally virtuous. The means designed by nature to be done to reach the end must be done, known, and loved. An operative power resembling prudence exists in particular reasons: shrewdness, craftiness, cleverness, an ability to do things ordered to an end, whether good or evil. Prudence, according to St. Thomas, is a species of shrewdness, ordered to the good, essentially related to the good. Because shrewdness is sometimes identified with prudence and prudence with wisdom, Aristotle says some people conclude that prudence, wisdom are not needed for happiness. But he says the habit of prudence is never united to this estimating power to relate it to choosing means to an end without right desire, moral virtue. Just as first principles of reasoning exist for speculative science, so in practical science the supreme good, happiness, exists as a first principle of practical reason. To the morally virtuous man, the supreme good as the final end, what we need to pursue, and the temperate good as the proximate end. Okay. To the morally virtuous man, the supreme good as the final end, and the temperate good as the proximate end, things we need to pursue as means, evidently known, are just as evident as first principles as are the first principles of speculative reason to a person who knows the meaning of part and whole. The morally virtuous man apprehends these principles with precision. What is really good appears really good in the estimate of sense of the morally virtuous man because prudence and moral virtue exist in this person's sense faculty. According to St. Thomas, moral vice perverts the judgment of reason and causes deception in the conception of practical principles on the level of reason. And I think he means there both universal and particular reason. Since we cannot reason well when we are mistaken about principles, the imprudent, vicious man cannot habitually reason well in practical matters, cannot possibly precisely conceive the human good or the means to it with any kind of consistency. Consequently, it appears to me that Aristotle and St. Thomas would conclude that, strictly speaking, modern science, in its prevailing contemporary understanding and practice, is a form of mathematically regulated and controlled shrewdness, cleverness, which by having intentionally divorced itself from wisdom and prudence lacks the moral and metaphysical culture needed to be science in a professional or real sense, and has become a serious threat to the survival of Western civilization and global peace. After considering in some detail that prudence cannot exist without moral virtue, Aristotle shows how moral virtue cannot exist without prudence, by first distinguishing between natural and moral virtue, and then stating moral virtue presupposes the existence of some level of natural moral virtue. Not moral virtue in a complete sense, presupposes a natural kind of inclination toward the virtuous, by which some men appear to be naturally disposed to some extent to be temperate, courageous, and just. Next, Aristotle considers these natural dispositions in three ways in relation to reason, practical reason that is, will, and sense appetite. In relation to practical reason, he says, first principles like do no evil are naturally implanted in human reason, by human nature. In relation to will, he claims that the will is naturally moved by the good apprehended as its proper object. In relation to sense appetite, he asserts that some men are naturally inclined to too much, too little, or with moderation, to different emotions like anger, pleasure, and so on. He says that the inclinations of natural reason and will are common, the natural inclinations of reason and will are common to all human beings. Nevertheless, St. Thomas adds, without addition of another principle through which they exist more perfectly, namely reason, right reason, they may be harmful. Even children and brute animals, like a lion, display virtuous inclinations. We call the lion, for example, noble and brave. A man with a strong inclination toward moral virtue can do much harm to his body, to external things, and other people, unless guided by right reason. Virtue, in its proper sense, natural virtue, is natural virtue rightly guided by right reason. Just as in reason, the reasoning part of the soul, that is, he's talking about the estimative sense here, two principles of operation exist, natural shrewdness and prudence. So in the appetitive part of the soul pertaining to moral virtue, two principles exist, natural and moral virtue. Without prudence, moral virtue cannot exist in the soul. St. Thomas adds that Aristotle confirms the claim he has made about the need for two kinds of moral principles by criticizing Socrates for saying that moral virtues are kinds of prudence, species of knowledge, saying Socrates was right in that moral virtue cannot exist without being accompanied by prudence, but he neglected too much the role of appetite, right desire in moral activity, claiming that others say too St. Thomas then claims that others say too little about moral virtue by maintaining that moral virtue must accord with reason, but reason need not direct moral virtue. No man can be prudent, St. Thomas claims, without moral virtue, or be morally virtuous without prudence. Next, Aristotle refutes philosophers who claim that one virtue can exist without another by saying, even though one person is not naturally inclined to all virtue, acquiring a virtue to which one is not strongly inclined by nature is difficult. In a way, a person naturally inclined to a virtue knows it, as Socrates held, has right reason about it. Strictly speaking, however, no virtue can exist without prudence, nor prudence without them. When prudence, a single virtue, exists, all the other virtues will simultaneously exist with it, Aristotle maintains. No virtue will exist formally, but only materially, and this is me speaking, without prudence. Different species of prudence do not exist for different species of virtue, St. Thomas claims. The same principle of prudence, ruled by right reason, right desire, applies to all species of moral virtue. While through a lack of enabling means a person is inclined to generosity, might be too poor to exercise the virtue of generosity, if those means are acquired, he says, the virtue will exist. Evident from the previous discussions about prudence is that even if prudence were not operative in the soul, we would need it because it perfects particular reason. Prudence is operative right choice, moral virtue in a complete sense. Moral virtue rightly disposes us to our end, happiness. Prudence rightly directs us toward the means that secure the end toward which moral virtue rightly disposes us. Finally, Aristotle ends his discussion of moral virtue, prudence, by solving the doubt previously raised about wisdom and prudence, by saying, first of all, that just as the art of medicine commands what a person should do to become healthy, it has no power over the health-generating faculty of the soul. It gives orders to people about how to secure health, but it gives no orders to the health-generating faculty, which doesn't have to obey it. So prudence and political science gives no orders about things to do, gives orders about things to do to obtain wisdom, something superior to prudence, but it gives no orders to wisdom about how to judge about divine matters. And second, he adds that to claim that prudence rules over wisdom is like claiming it rules over the gods, because it gives directives about everything people do in a state.